I'm a little bit bitter because Terry Heyman told me there was a dress code tonight. I think she wanted to see me sweat. Do you guys all want to hear a twisted story? Okay, this is, at the end, you'll all have the same question. How is this a glorious day? And I'll explain that. My father was 6'4" and weighed 270 pounds. What's your question? What happened, right? The DNA results of me are still pending. But as big as my dad was, around his father-in-law, he shrunk. Because his father-in-law was a great businessman, and my father, not so much. Think like Ralph Cramden and the Honeymooners, a lot of get-rich-quick schemes. And the two men were salesmen by profession, but the product they were always fighting over was my mom. Now, it didn't help matters that my father went bankrupt, and my mother and us three kids wound up going to live with his father-in-law, my grandfather. Now, we called my grandfather Pop-Up. The reason we called him Pop-Up was his wife, Mom, refused to be considered a grandmother. So we went into Pop-Up's house down the Jersey Shore. Pop-Up was a former Air Force man, ran a tight ship, presided over every meal, like these tables here. He sat at one end, at the very end were the kids. Every meal, breakfast. My father was in Philadelphia at the time and would pop in for weekends, like on a Friday night. My grandfather did not like my father's drinking. So what he did was he had an 11 p.m. curfew. Every Friday night, he'd lock the doors to the house. This caused my dad to become a very adept burglar. He would scale the side of the house and break into the house and then sneak in. Then he would come into breakfast in the morning like a soldier getting in before roll call and slide down at the end of the table and sit with the kids. On the day in question, the glorious day, my father was in the house but missed roll call. And this is the twisted part of the story. After breakfast, Pop-Up went out of the garage. And he was doing an errand. He was lowering this wooden garage door. It caught on his finger, cutting it off. Yes, oh, horrible. Running for the exits. My mother drove him in frantically to the hospital. She gets him to the hospital. The doctor says, you know, if we can get the other end of this finger, we can sew it right back on. My mother calls to the house. My father's name was Frank. And my mother always believed in my father. She said, could I speak to Frank? They put my dad on the phone. She goes, Frank, you gotta go to the garage and get my father's finger. My father was like, who is this? The resulting butt finger, you like that? We were kids. We had a lot of nicknames. Tiny Hand, Rumpelstiltskin, which just is funny because the word rump was in it, we're kids. You know? It was a gruesome looking thing. But the thing about it that really upset my grandfather was nobody had any sympathy for him. All they talked about was, did you hear what Frank did? And they thought that was just great. Now my father's philosophy of life was you look at the donut. Now that might explain why he was 270 pounds. You look at the donut, not the whole. You look at what you have in life, not what you don't have. And he dealt with his bankruptcy, his heart condition, his losing the finger. You know, he's like, oh, he's got 9.5 fingers. He had dealt with all those things that way. I took that same philosophy, and I'm very grateful that 3 years of my life I lived with my grandparents. Not many people get that opportunity. Now, in 5th grade, my father got back on his feet financially. We moved to Pennsylvania. But we'd still visit Pop-Up. And we'd visit Pop-Up like on the holidays. And then he'd have big gatherings, the whole extended Irish Catholic family. He'd have these big gatherings. He'd extend the table out. And he'd be in all his glory, cutting off giant helpings of food for everybody at the table, except for one person. And what would happen is he'd carve this little tiny piece of meat, put it on a plate, and be handed from uncle to cousin, and they each would snicker as they saw it, as it got passed all the way down to the end of the table where my father sat. But when my father got it, he never complained. Now that's my story. The question you have is, what kind of sick person thinks that is a glorious day? Let me explain. Yesterday was my birthday. It's a weird, thank you. It's a weird day for me because I am now the age my father was when he passed away. And because my father passed away young, he never met my kids or, at all. But every single time my kids meet anybody who ever knew my father or knew of my father, the first thing out of their mouth is, Frank Carmody, do you know the finger story? And believe me, my kids know this story. But the person then launches into telling the story. And they tell it, and my kids politely listen and nod their head. And as the person tells that story, my father, my mother, my grandfather, all who've been long gone, are resurrected. Because that's what stories do, right? They keep precious memories alive. You see, my grandfather sacrificed a finger, but in exchange, he got them all a slice of immortality. And at the end of the story, the person finishes and they go to my kids, that's Frank Carmody. He was something. And my kids turn to me and smile. And for a few brief moments, my father is to my kids what he's always been to me, larger than life. Thank you. Dr. Carmody.
Good job. Nice job.